Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden, English teacher and an author with over 30 published novels. And on this week's episode, I have a returning guest, Dr. Gerold Yonas, and he's going to be talking about his second book in his Project Z novel series, and this is The Dragon's Brain. Before we jump into the series and the many interesting topics that it encompasses, Gerold, go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, basically, I'm a professional scientist and engineer, and I worked for many years in national laboratories and the government and the Pentagon and in many committees, some of which were important national level scientific committees. And I've been retired for over a decade now. And in order to explain some of my opinions in a way that are not too argumentative, I've couched them all in a fictional form, together with a lot of satire. I also had a lot of characters which I really had close relationship with, but I changed the characters. I made them, instead of being old, I'd make them young. Instead of being one race, I'd make them another race. I changed the grad. But in any case, I didn't want it to be too obvious. But some people become obvious who I'm really talking about in the government and in national lab. And some of the technology also happens to be changing very rapidly. And I have in some ways anticipated what is going on. In some ways, I'm trying to be a bit of a prophet, but there's no way I would get away with that. So I make it so exaggerated that people enjoy it.
Well, definitely. And we'll get into kind of your blend of reality and science and fiction, because you bring a lot of different elements into the stories. But before we get too far into that, for those who haven't read any of the books in the series, we do have an earlier interview with Gerold where you can hear more in depth about book one of the Project Z series. But Gerold, if you could just kind of briefly recap what was going on in book one and then where your characters are starting off in book two to help orient our listeners.
Book one is really based on the exploits of a fictional physicist in Los Alamos National Lab and his boss, the lab director, and a member of a Chinese secret organization, and various other technical characters. But in every one of my books, there are technical inventions that really dominate the arc of the plot. And in the first book, it's all about the invention of the clean, cheap, inexhaustible, the ultimate energy source. And I wanted that invention to be slightly plausible. And in fact, it's the low energy nuclear reaction that really is a discovery in that first book. And it turns out the Department of Energy is funding research in low energy nuclear reactions. At one time, it was called cold fusion. But it is thought to be the ultimate energy source because it uses ordinary materials and produces directly electricity in the first book without any pollution. The way the first book ends, it's been discovered in the laboratory, but it has not become a useful energy source. So what you're left with is, how are you going to go from a discovery into a real source of energy? But in the meantime, it has a deadly weapons application because it can become the ultimate nuclear-driven space weapon by producing an electromagnetic field. So when the first book ends, the reader really doesn't know, has it become something other than a deadly weapon? Will the energy supply ever happen? Or will the Chinese actually perfect it first and use it as a weapon? That's left open. And the hero has his own problems. He has a love interest who is an undercover FBI agent. He's trying to figure out his own life. And then the second book starts off with what becomes the actual application of and demonstration of the ultimate energy source. Well, what's interesting is while this was being written, a major accomplishment happened in the real world when a fusion burn, this is hot fusion burn, with a high-power laser at the Livermore National Lab, and that happened while this was all being written. So this breakthrough now has led to a major global investment in fusion research. Well, in my fiction version, it's a global investment in an entirely new energy source, the low-energy nuclear reactor. And then it moves from there with competing applications. Some of the applications are weapons, and some of the applications are ultimate energy. And they're unexpected problems that occur even when it really works perfectly. There are unintended consequences of the perfect solution. In general, what my books really claim is that too much of a good thing is not very good at all. The unexpected consequences keep coming up, and the competition between the peaceful applications and the weapons application comes through in the first book and also continuing in the second book.
I think it's a very realistic way to present it because so much of any type of new technology, new science that comes, there is that battle between what good can it do, but often doing good and helping isn't necessarily terribly profitable. So then to get the investments, it's like, okay, well, how can we weaponize this or how can we commercialize it and turn it into something that's going to generate income? Because that's the promise that attracts those investors, and just how people's minds work as humans, we tend to look for the greatest benefit in a situation, and unfortunately, that's often destructive.
What happens is the available funding to really make a practical application is rejected by the government in my novel because the government has something else. They already have their own preconceived notion. Now, that is a metaphor. I'm not talking about Elon Musk and NASA, but that's what it's all about. And in the end, the application is funded by some combination of the United States and the private sector and the Chinese government that wants to get in on its ultimate energy source. And it really does work. And like everything else in my books, once it starts to be a wonderful idea and things are working out, then there's that oops. And in this case, the energy source creates an epidemic. It's very much like the so-called Havana syndrome, where electromagnetic energy causes the brain to be modified. And when the environment is filled with that kind of energy, there is a global neurological pandemic. And so that's the problem that has to be solved. And so I invent something that solves the problem, but it also creates an evil application. And so that back and forth between a useful application and not very acceptable application, it runs through the book. But it turns out that this solution that I invent in the book to deal with the neurological pandemic, I also think that invention can have a practical application in today's world because, frankly, I'm getting old. What I have learned as you get old, you spend a lot of time thinking about the hereafter. You know what I mean, DelSheree?
Mm-hmm.
See, I go in the garage. My wife sends me to go in the garage and get paper towels, and I go out there and I go, what am I hereafter?
I
So
like
what
that.
That's the problem of the aging brain. We've done a lot to help people deal with their physical problems, but we have a major problem. When people get to be over 80 or over 85, they start to have the hereafter problem. And I think that what I'm prophesizing in my second book is that there's a solution. And the solution has to do with a gadget that I call the brain aid. In the first book, the gadget that dominates the book is a low-energy nuclear reactor that solves the energy problems of the world. In the second book, the solution is a brain aid that solves the problems of the aging brain. And I think it's going to happen. I've couched it in a fictitious form, so the reader doesn't really know whether I'm serious. But I'm serious.
Well, that's interesting. We've seen so much advancement just within the last decade in a lot of different realms. So, a lot of things that are presented in a science fiction type of realm really do get people thinking of what would prevent that from being possible. Where is the science at right now that could bring us closer to these things that we've seen? I mean, because there's a lot in older fiction that really wasn't very far off. And we're seeing some of those uses now. I guess not so much, hoverboards from Back to the Future didn't really catch on, but there is a smaller gap, I think, between sci-fi and what we see in the real world today because everything does progress so quickly in this age where we've got a lot to start from in the beginning.
In the case of the aging brain and early stage dementia and Alzheimer's, it's become, as people live longer lives, it's become an epidemic. And so there's a lot of research going on around the world in that particular area of dealing with the causes of that kind of dementia. That research is exploding. And I touch on that in my book, but in a fictitious form. I'm willing to wager that in a few years, there will be products on the market that are very similar to the thing I call the brain aid, and it'll become a reality. And if I had a few tens of millions of dollars to throw around, I might even develop myself. But I'm hoping some company will pick it up, make it real.
And it's one of those things that it has those dual aspects of the potential to help a lot of people, but also to be commercially successful, where it's something that could get funding, that could get interest from private companies because there is money to be made off of that. And you hope that those two things balance out overall, that people are helped. Whoever invested the money, is able to be successful with that without too many negative consequences or without things that are developed being used in other applications. And you deal a lot with that in yours.
In my fiction, there's always a negative implication of advancing technology. So in this case, although it is a tremendous advance in dealing with various difficult neurological diseases, it also becomes addictive. Like everything else, too much of a good thing, not very good. And the addictive problem becomes a national problem. And again, this will certainly happen with any new invention that is misused. You say, well, are we going to regulate it? How is it going to misuse? For instance, right now, AI is beginning to drive economic investment to the point where I think the most valuable company in the world is turning out to be an AI, artificial intelligence chip company, NVIDIA. But it's going to be regulated. At some point, people are going to say, well, wait a minute, it's going to change the way people work. Eventually, computers will take over. So in my book, I invent something else that is more powerful and more capable than artificial intelligence computers. That's something I call a collective. You say, well, it's a combination of human beings and machines that can outthink any machine and outthink any human. Of course, that's an old idea, too. That could be the board. And as you know, trying to defeat the board would be futile. But in my book, you can see how even the most wonderful invention of a cure for neurological diseases can be misused and can become an evil force.
Well, and I think that you bringing up AI, that's a really important topic right now, especially both of us being writers. It's something I've been keeping an eye on and kind of listening to what's going on in that realm. AI audio narration has become a really big thing, and I was researching there's various companies that have different levels of AI narration. And one of them that I found interesting was that this company has recruited well-known voices to license their voice to an AI narrator. And then they will use their program to adapt your text into an audiobook using these voices that they've licensed. But there are still not enough laws in place to know how that product is copyrighted. And it did kind of come to mind while I was reading yours of that idea of, oh, we've got a new tool, we've got this fancy new technology, or we've got, whatever it is. And humans kind of have that tendency to just dive in with something before they fully understand it. And I think that's a lot of where, as you bring up, we kind of have those unintended consequences that you get rushed into development. We've got to build this facility. We've got to start using it. We're going to do this and that and the other before we really totally understand what's going on. And then only once it's really put into place on a wide scale sometimes is where you start to see those negative aspects or the unintended consequences or uses or various things like that you really get to understand it. And with your background in science and being involved in these types of projects, do you think that there is a way kind of staying within the research and lab stage of a new technology? Can you discover or uncover, might be the better word, some of those negative or unintended uses or consequences of something without it going widespread?
That's where I see the tremendous value of science fiction. Nobody is going to constrain me from inventing something as long as it's fiction. And then I can also invent the consequences because I'm thinking through the arc of the plot. If you're really trying to invent a plot, you think through the consequences, and how do you mediate those consequences? How do you go on to the next step? Because you're going to have to finish the darn story at some point, and it just keeps going on and on. So I think the science fiction writer has the ability to invent the new technology, invent the consequence, and maybe invent the solution. Now, in some cases, I haven't quite invented the solutions. And so that's why I have another book being written, which hopefully will have solutions. I'm not at this point very optimistic, and it's a bit depressing in today's world, but I'm going to keep at it. I'm going to invent some solutions. Now, if I tell you what solution I'm groping with, you're going to say, well, this is that same old story. Some alien comes in and solves the problem of global conflict. No, we're not going to have aliens. We're going to have something else. And so the reader's going to have to figure out what could it possibly be. But that's what I'm groping with. I just don't want to end it without some kind of solution, which, by the way, the solution will also have an unintended consequence, which unfortunately could require book 4. It goes on and on. But there is tremendous value in having. I believe that science fiction writers can make a tremendous contribution to invention and thinking through consequences and maybe mitigating the consequences.
Well, and it's interesting to see, like we were talking earlier, how sometimes science fiction in the past really does end up being fairly predictive of the direction things go. And I do think that that is a great way to explore some of the potential problems or outcomes, and that maybe put that in the public's mind, even if it's not necessarily sinking in or reaching the people who are doing the research of like, oh, that's fiction or whatever. But it can help people, I think a little bit more and be a little bit more aware as a private citizen of thinking, is this something we should jump right into? Should I take advantage of this opportunity? What might be the long-term consequences of it? And it's interesting to see how a form of art can inspire that thoughtfulness and get people to start thinking and becoming part of a wider conversation about something that maybe might not have really struck their interest just on the basis of reading an article in the news about a scientific discovery or advance or something in that context. We can invest in it a little bit more in fiction, where I think it can kind of spark that conversation and start people thinking about things like that maybe they wouldn't otherwise.
There's no question about it that when you have the freedom to write fiction, the freedom to invent science and technology, it allows you to open your mind to something that never would be acceptable as a refereed publication, but something where you don't work out all the details. You leave something out. You don't let your mind be stopped by too much of reality. And then once you start to do that, you start to invent the consequences. Then people will, I think it could be very entertaining. And then people might think about, well, what would happen in the real world if something like that happened? Can you really, I used to think about being able to predict what will happen in the world of global conflict. And what's happening today is almost beyond my imagination. Mm-hmm. And the application of technology to global conflict is changing so fast. For instance, in my book, I invented this space-based nuclear electromagnetic pulse weapon. And I invented this brain-damaging electromagnetic pulse. And those things appeared in the press while I was writing. We'll say, well, I stole the idea from the newspapers. But in fact, these things happened at practically the same time. And technology is changing so fast that it really is important to have an imagination and see what might be. Of course, there will be people who are unscrupulous, who will invent things and sell them to the public and raise a lot of cash and create private companies and mislead the public. That's called the Ponzi scheme. It's always been there and going to be there again. So thinking through what might be and how to deal with it, I think is valuable.
I think so too. Well, and something else that, as you mentioned, kind of everything going on today in the world, a lot of it, may seem far away. We read about it, but those of us who are not living in some of those areas aren't necessarily experiencing it. And one of the things that I think is interesting about fiction and that I thought about while reading The Dragon's Brain is that fiction can take some of those situations, those consequences, circumstances, and bring it to a more personal level that as the reader you can take in and connect with. And I thought that that was something that you brought into the story of it's not just widespread off in the distance somewhere far out, that you kind of showed how these advances, if they're not anticipated or, these things aren't thought through to see what some of these negative consequences can be, then you get to see how it really affects people on just that individual level and what it does to human lives in a way that in reality, it's not often the case that people get that close personal experience where they see how something impacts a person on that individual level.
In addition to the implications for the individual and how that person relates to technology, is the influence of politics and national decision-making. And once you have politics involved, once you have decision-making, social, political, and economic decision-making, you're going to wind up with events that will be totally unpredictable. It's such a complex environment with so many different variables that the outcome is totally unpredictable. So why not just imagine how it's going to be? Is there going to be a national level congressional hearing? Is there going to be strange articles published by unscrupulous authors in the press influencing the public? How will these things really wind up leading to investments? Will the investments run out of control? Will you really have a Ponzi scheme for this new invention? And so I explore those things and I let them happen. And sometimes they work out okay, and sometimes they don't. And then if you add to that the complexity of having global conflict, in my books, the conflict is between the United States, China, and Russia. And the United States is trying to be the good guy and try to somehow prevent the conflict between China and Russia. But in the end, the conflicts emerge and there are global consequences. In today's world, with so much depending on space applications and so much depending on computers and information technology, the opportunity for the emergence of weapons and a catastrophe leaves open the many outcomes that could be the next novel that may turn out to be okay, although I've got a lot of work to do to make things work out okay.
I am sure you will sort it all out as you get through your process. You really do. You bring in a lot of different elements, and there's this political aspect to the books that can be, I think, difficult to manage and to put everything into the appropriate focus, where it's not, I would say, stereotyping the different groups involved and relying heavily on those kind of preconceived ideas that people might have in place. And so how do you deal with that? In your private career, you had to deal with a lot of politics and multi-group and multinational projects. So did you draw on that from your previous experience, kind of putting that into play in the book? Did you kind of take more fictional license?
Yes. In fact, I had, during the period of detente, I had very close relations with Russians. In fact, many Russian scientists became my close personal friends. And at the same time that was going on, I was quite aware that there was, for the non-military applications, there were military applications, and there was political controversy about what was going on, was involved in the press. Now, I described many of these kinds of events that occurred to me, including some strange things when I was in the Pentagon, like the time that I was accused by a reporter of helping the aliens design the propulsion system for their spaceship. Well, of course, I put that into the book as fiction, but it turns out that really did. I really was accused of being in cahoots with the aliens. And so strange and chaotic things do happen in reality. And it doesn't take a heck of a lot of imagination to exaggerate those events and then put them into a story. And that's what I do. Probably every person, every character in the book, every event, every small change in political and scientific and technological advancement that I describe in the book really happened in some form or another, usually another, in my real life. So if I sit there and think about it, there's plenty of material for a new book.
Absolutely. Well, and it sounds like you're underway working on book 3. Tell us a little bit about kind of what you're envisioning. Do you think this will end up being the end to the series? And how is that process of kind of working through tying things up? And as you said, you're still kind of working on finalizing maybe how it's all going to end. But what is that process like for you in something as complex as everything you've got going on in the Project Z novels?
Well, the way I can describe the process is the art of being stumped. I'm really stumped. I'm really frozen. I cannot figure out a happy ending. There are so many rapid changes in economics, in technology, in the environment, in global conflict, that it's very easy for me to imagine a dystopian end to this next book, but I refuse to do that. So I'm trying to think about, from the point of view of fiction, what could I invent that can really change things? Of course, everything's been done. Everything's been written. Every time growing up, I remember going to the movie theater when I was a kid and seeing all the various horror stories. And so in the end, they seem to turn out okay in the movies. So I'm trying to figure out how these things make sense in today's world. Today's world is getting to be kind of dangerous. Increasingly dangerous. It would be easy to get depressed by it all. And I'm trying to be optimistic about how technology and sociology and economics fit together. But if you just watch TV or read some of the conspiracy theories, it doesn't work out very well. We're going to know about the future after the election. I mean, a lot of things being proposed in the conspiracy world today are really scary.
Well, and yeah, I was going to ask you if part of your thought process on writing these novels, how much you actively stay engaged with what's going on in the world and news and scientific discovery, or are there times where you need to take a step back and kind of look at it more just from the point of view of your world that you've created and where you want it to end up? And it sounds like it's a little bit of both, and trying to balance that has gotten a bit challenging lately with everything that we're seeing.
I am totally immersed in following. I read all the literature, and in particular in neuroscience and computing and global conflict and emerging weapons technology. I'm very much immersed in trying to keep up and then see how it turns into a beneficial outcome. All I'm saying is right now, working on the last book, I'm having a tough time making it turn out well because there's so many dangerous things that are going on. For instance, we have depended to a great degree on applications of low Earth orbit space satellites for communications, for timing, for banking, for God knows everything else. Space is an incredibly dangerous place. Space weapons are going to happen. How will we regulate space weapons? In the area of neurological problems, well, the pandemic occurred. Who predicted a global pandemic? Well, in my book, I predicted global neurological pandemic, and then a cure for the neurological pandemic that, of course, backfires. Those things can happen. With information technology, now AI coming to the front, there could be inventions and applications and misuse of that technology. There's so much that's going on today that's very useful for the science fiction writer that it can become depressing if you don't find solutions to the problem. I don't write just for make people nervous. I write because I find it fun. It's entertaining to write, to invent, to find solutions. And I hope the reader will read the things I write and also enjoy it. But it's very depressing at the end. No one will want to read that. So I'm looking for a better ending.
I have confidence that you'll find it. Maybe getting through the next little bit and seeing where things land on multiple areas that we have a lot of conflict and strife going on right now. But I think that you will find that ending that you're looking for. And I think people will be looking forward to it as they get through books 1 and 2 and have the opportunity to see where you take your characters and the rest of the series.
Well, I'm looking forward to a happy outcome as well. If I can do it, then hopefully the readers will enjoy it.
I think so. Well, and Gerold, we are just about out of time. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you a chance. Where can people find you and the books and stay on top of the progress for book 3?
Where can they find the book?
Yeah, if people want to go out and grab it, where should they go looking?
Bookstore, and there's so many ways to buy books today. There's no problem with that. I'm doing book signings. I'm going to do a book signing this Sunday at Barnes and Noble, and I expect hopefully there'll be people that are interested in buying books. But books are available everywhere today. A lot of people who I know who are elderly say, "Well, I can't read your books because I can't read." They keep asking me, "Can you do an audio book?" And I don't know the answer to that. But I think an audio book would be great. I don't know how to make it happen. Another thing would be, I think, nice or useful would be if one of the movie producers decides to make TV series out of the stories. There's so many twists and turns that a TV series would work out very nicely. And that's how I think people could really get into this.
Well, I hope someone takes notice and picks that up at some point. And audiobooks are definitely in the realm of possibilities. And I know your publisher has started to get into that area of publishing. So hopefully soon we'll keep our fingers crossed for that.
Well, if he could do that, that would be good. Because I know a lot of people, as people have time to read, some people have problems with their vision. Mm-hmm. Vision is, hearing and vision. And the strange thing about getting old, it's not just the memory that goes, but there are a lot of other problems that occur. As medical science improves and improves the lifetime of human beings, all these problems are going to be more and more prevalent.
Unfortunately so, but I think we're getting adaptive technologies that are hopefully helpful in making things more accessible to people. And looking forward to hopefully seeing your books in more forms as time goes on. But I did want to thank you, Gerold, for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you both times.